Good morning, people of Guam. This is a joint public hearing meeting. We're called to order. Hoffaday, the Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing, and the Committee on Health, Tourism, Historic Preservation, Land, and Justice now called to order. Today is Friday, May 8th. The time now is 1:04. Welcome to everyone connected by Zoom and those tuning in via television or the YouTube channel. Thank you for your patience in accommodating this Zoom platform while we maintain health emergency physical distancing mandates. Public notices for this joint public hearing were disseminated via email to all centers and all media broadcasting outlets on Thursday, April 30th, and again on Wednesday, May 6th. This notice was also published in the Guam Daily Post on Friday, May 1st, and Wednesday, May 6th. The general rules of conduct. This Zoom meeting is hosted by the legislature's MIS staff, and I thank them for their assistance. The host of this hearing will mute all Zoom participants until called upon by the chair. Members of the committee and or the legislature wishing to speak may indicate their desire to the chair through the in-app chat feature. Individuals testifying shall first be recognized by the chair before speaking and begin by stating their name for record-keeping purposes. When called to speak, please ensure that you are unmuted. Questions and testimony shall be confined to the substance or nature of the agenda. Personal inference as to the character or the motive of any senator or any individual testifying is not permitted. Any violation of this general rule of conduct will result in removal from the public hearing by the host. Please ensure that your video remains on throughout the hearing and that you are visible. Participants must be visible at all times and not engage in other activity during the hearing. Failure to keep video on and visibility will cause removal from the Zoom platform. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues that have joined me, and we have the sponsor of the bill, Senator Therese Terlaje. We have also joining us, and I'm just going to go across the screen here. We have Minority Leader Senator Terlaje. We have Senator Kelly Mars Taitano. We have Senator Eugene Besco Lee. We have Senator Amanda Shelton. We have Vice Speaker Senator Talina Nelson, and we have also Senator Luis Muñoz. And looking through the screen, we have the staff and folks of the other senators, which is not a problem. And before we hear from the panel, I'd like to invite Senator Therese Terlaje, the author of the bill, Bill 321, to introduce her bill. Madam Senator Therese.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Bill number 321 intends to protect residential tenants from eviction during a proclamation of a state of emergency or public health emergency by making it unlawful for a person or business to evict or to file an unlawful detainer proceedings against a residential tenant of residential housing after the proclamation of the state of emergency and for a period of 30 days following that declaration. So we've heard that there are approximately 38,000 individuals experiencing substantial losses of income during this emergency as a result of business closures, the loss of hours or wages or layoffs, and it's hindering their ability to keep up with rent and, of course, every other bill that they have. The economic impacts of the COVID-19 have been significant and threaten to undermine housing security across our island. We've heard from the CDC that homelessness can exacerbate vulnerability to COVID-19 and other public health threats. So this measure is intended to preserve and increase housing security during the emergency and at least for 30 days after. Prior to introducing this bill at the end of March, I had also reached out to the judiciary to ask for their consideration of a moratorium on eviction actions. And because of the closure of the court, they had corresponding with the governor's executive order, also mandating a moratorium on evictions. Both of those together pretty much have put a halt on any evictions for the period of the emergency that we are still under up to now, Mr. Chair. So the latest administrative order from the courts is effective until June 5th, 2020. That puts all civil actions on hold until that time. As the judiciary and other government services prepare to reopen during this public health emergency, this bill aims to provide tenants who are unable to make rent just a little bit more time to get on their feet. So when I asked for the hearing on this bill, at that time, the community was still waiting for economic relief programs, especially the federal and then the federal programs. And so hopefully the majority of the economic impact payments will go out next week, and that would be a relief for some of these tenants. The pandemic unemployment assistance program is not yet established, and so this will still leave many in our community without income. I asked the Department of Public Health this morning if they would be providing any additional housing assistance in addition to the current shelter capacities that they have going forward, and they responded that they did not have plans at this time to increase that capacity. There may be a program at the Department of Parks and Rec, I think, that is looking at expanding homeless shelters at this time, Mr. Chair. I'm, of course, this bill has ramifications for landlords who have also experienced very severe fiscal impacts from the emergency. And so we're still trying to work that angle. It seems like it's been very complex, at least in my experience, trying to find a way to support landlords at this time. We know that Congress has been having some discussions regarding possibly providing additional relief to landlords, and that the governor in her executive order 2020-07 directs the Department of Revenue and Taxation to immediately engage with financial institutions to identify any tools, means, or methods that could provide relief from the threat of residential foreclosure. We've also heard recently, just in discussions with Gita, that they are also looking into possible relief programs that may address the concerns for landlords. So I'm hoping that some of these will be successful, and as we move forward, Mr. Chair. So as we've been told by numerous economic experts and the administration's fiscal team, that the island's economy may take some time to recover. This is just a measure that's hoping to establish a safety net to protect those vulnerable members of our community from losing their place of shelter and safety during this pandemic and as we rebuild our economy. Mr. Chair, for conducting the hearing on this bill.
Thank you, Senator Therese. We will now accept testimony from the representatives of the Para Total Hit Community Group, and let me see if we I'm not too sure who would that be presenting. Senator Therese, do you know who would be giving that testimony? Because I know they did.
Caitlin,
is that Kate? Caitlin?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am, McManus? Oh, okay, there you go.
Affidavit. So I'll be representing Para Total Hit. We're a laterally organized collective of working class and unemployed residents of Guam, both native Chamorro and also non-native in our group. We seek housing justice for all residents of Guam, particularly the most economically vulnerable, disabled, elderly, and houseless. We already sent our petition, our testimony, I believe. One of our group members already emailed it in. I was just gonna read two of our measures in our petition that we still are asking to be met. From our measures to measure number 3, suspend all residential and small commercial rent charges and late fees for unpaid bills for the duration of the state of emergency, or failing that, ensure that no one will ever be evicted, have their home foreclosed, or have utilities shut off, neither now nor after the crisis has abated due to non-payment that occurred during the state of emergency. Require landlords, banks, and utility companies to accept partial payment plans and grant payment forgiveness to residents unable to pay during the state of emergency, and require that landlords, banks, and utility companies never retaliate against residents for such situations. We request that no rent, mortgages, and accompanying late fees occurred during the state of emergency ever be used to evict or foreclose any homes. So that's from Measure 3. And then I'm going to read Measure 5, which is to freeze all rent and utility prices at current levels until the end of the year, which is December 31, 2020. Families with insecure housing are vulnerable families. It is increasingly difficult, even impossible, for families to maintain a home that is both affordable, in good repair, and spacious enough. Even in low-income housing, such as the low-income housing tax credit properties, individuals are routinely evicted for minor offenses, such as exceeding the allowed amount of utilities expenditures. These occurrences uproot families, disrupt schooling, and contribute to chronic public health crisis of poverty, mental health issues, family violence, crime, and financial insecurity in Guam. We ask that you consider the low-wage workers of Guam and all that we contribute to the island's economy. We also deserve to live secure, safe, and fulfilling lives. Secure, safe, and fulfilling lives and homes we are not afraid to be evicted from simply because we may fall behind in our payments due to extenuating circumstances. At this time, we are dealing with unprecedented circumstances, and we are not alone. Low-wage workers throughout the United States are experiencing the same issues, and we ask that Guam's elected officials find creative solutions to this crisis. And this bill will really help if it is passed, and we really appreciate Senator Terlaje and all of you for doing that. That's it. That's
All right. That's your testimony, right? And representative of Torohit Community Group.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone else that would like to present testimony in favor of the bill? And I know that for the record, the committee has requested feedback from the following: Guam Housing Corporation, Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority, the Guam Chamber of Commerce, the Guam Women's Chamber of Commerce, Guam Realtors Association, the Guam Bar Association, and the Judiciary of Guam. We do have testimony opposition to the bill, and that's from Mr. Joe Manabusan. I'll have one of my staff read the testimony so that we make sure that everything is heard. And my colleagues should have all received their copy, but it'll at least be read for the record. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This testimony was received by the office and is from Mr. Joe Manabusan, and it reads, May 4th, 2020, regarding Bill number 321-35, Hafiday Senator Therese Terlaje. I'm seriously concerned about your introduction of Bill number 321-35, which would not only prohibit evicting and filing unlawful detainee proceedings against residential tenants of residential housing after the proclamation of a state of emergency or public health emergency, but also criminalizes such evicting and filing and makes these acts prosecutable as misdemeanors and punishable by 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine, or even both. Your bill specifically targets residential landlords. However, please remember that not all residential landlords are commercial companies that may or may not have the capacity to weather the financial burden of tenants failing to pay rent during a public health emergency. Instead, many residential landlords are hardworking families that have proper business permits to rent just one home. This is very different from a commercial company that owns and operates several apartment complexes. Bill number 321-35 fails to consider the circumstances of these non-commercial residential landlords. Tenants are not the only ones suffering during the current pandemic. Bill 321-35 completely ignores the fact that the residential landlords are also suffering during this pandemic too. For example, here is a landlord-tenant scenario that is actually happening right now on island. Tenant failed to pay rent due on February 15, 2020, about a month before the governor declared a public health emergency in March. Tenant again failed to pay rent due on March 15, 2020. And for a third time, tenant failed to pay rent due on April 15, 2020. Landlord uses tenant's monthly rent to pay landlord's mortgage loan and utility bills for power, water, and solid waste. However, since tenant failed to pay rent for these 3 months, Landlord is now forced to pay out of his own pocket for all of these bills. Landlord's mortgage lender has not offered forbearance or deferment for his mortgage loan and has instead demanded immediate payment and threatened foreclosure several times. Based on the above real-life scenario, because tenant has failed to pay rent for 3 months, there should be no impediment to landlord evicting tenant for violating the rental agreement and finding a new tenant to pay rent so that landlord can continue to pay his mortgage, loan, and utility bills. But your bill, Senator, prohibits landlord from obtaining much-needed relief that is already properly afforded under Guam law. You, Senator, are now making it illegal to evict tenant, even though tenant failed to pay rent for 3 months and caused economic hardship to landlord. Even worse, Senator, you are now making it a crime for landlord to evict tenant. Specifically, if landlord dares to evict tenant because landlord cannot afford to cover a fourth time for tenant's rent, you, Senator, want to charge landlord with a misdemeanor and put him in jail for 1 year and charge him a $10,000 fine, even though both Guam law and the rental agreement allow landlord to evict. I do not want to believe that you, Senator, intended Bill 32135 to put residential landlords in jail for 1 year and charge them a $10,000 fine just because they do not want to use their own hard-earned money to cover for the financial obligations that a tenant has agreed to in writing. I do not want to believe that you, Senator, believe that it is fair and right for a tenant to improperly use Bill number 32135 as a shield that allows that a tenant to stay for free in a residential rental unit for as long as the public health emergency lasts, with the current pandemic entering its 3rd month now. The cost of passing Bill number 321-35, Senators, should not come at the expense of financially burdening landlords and threatening them with jail time and excessive fine when a landlord chooses to go to court for much needed relief that is already properly afforded under Guam law. For these reasons, I am very much hoping that you do not move forward with Bill 321-35 and that you do not cause landlords to suffer more hardships, financial and otherwise, during this pandemic. Tenants are not the only ones suffering this pandemic, Senator. Landlords are suffering this pandemic also. Please do not forget that, because your Bill 321-35 certainly does. Si Juez Masi for thoughtfully considering these serious concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, those were the only 2 testimony, 1 for and 1 against. Senator Therese, I open up the floor for any of your comments before I ask any of our colleagues if they have any questions.
Thank you. I just like to thank Caitlin for the testimony today, and your organization. We've been advocating since pretty much the beginning of this emergency when we start to see the fiscal impacts. So thank you for all your advocacy for not just this, but other issues. I think we've been fortunate, Mr. Chair, that the utilities have also, stepped up to defer late fees for those for the period of this emergency, and that some mortgage companies have also stepped up or been ordered to defer also their late fees and to allow late payment on mortgages. But there are some mortgage companies that obviously are not affording that opportunity, and it is a real issue. I totally acknowledge that. And I just have to say that I'm going to continue to work to find a solution that also benefits those, especially landlords facing mortgages that are not being deferred or not being delayed. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you.
Thank you, Senator Therese. Based on the chat here, I see that listed here, I have Senator Lee, and then Senator Amanda, and then it'll be Senator Kelly. Senator Lee, your questions, ma'am.
Si Juez Masi, Mr. Chair, are you able to hear me? Yes? Okay. I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank everyone who submitted testimony. I believe Mr. Manabusin and Caitlin on behalf of Paratodosit. So Ms. McManus, I just have a quick question for you. I understand the organization's support for this bill and why you believe that it's needed. But upon hearing the feedback and the testimony from Mr. Manabusin, do you or would you still support a bill like this that would lessen the penalty or would not criminalize a landlord for potentially evicting a tenant? Because basically Mr. Manabusin is saying that making these acts prosecutable as misdemeanors and punishable by 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine, or even both of those things together, that's it takes it too far. So would you still be in support of this bill if the committee considered lessening some of those penalties, or because I can understand both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to hear from you to see if you would still support this bill if we could come to a better resolution and not criminalize these landlords who are also being placed in a very difficult position at this time.
Yes. Well, like for example, he gave that example where his tenant wasn't paying even before the pandemic, and I do agree with him that those payments should still be made, anything before the pandemic. But I do not think that he should be charging for anything during the pandemic. Any payments due or any bill made during the pandemic, I don't believe landlords should be accumulating those debts, especially when people are out of work or their hours were lessened. I don't agree with that. So like I half and half agree. If you're going to evict someone because they couldn't pay for their bills that accumulated only specifically during the pandemic, I agree that they should be punished for that. Maybe it doesn't have to be a year, maybe less, but nobody should be evicted for not being able to pay their bills that were accumulated during the pandemic. But if it was something that was prior to, and they go back to work after the pandemic, that's why in here we stated that landlords can work an agreement. They can make an agreement with the tenant. Tenant can pay off what was due before the pandemic. But I strongly agree that nothing accumulated during the pandemic should be billed for.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that you would still support the bill even if we brought some of these penalties down a little bit and not criminalize this behavior? You would still be in support of.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Amanda Shelton, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the sponsor of the legislation and also everyone who's provided testimony, Paratotis Hit and Mr. Mendiola as well. Thank you very much for the perspective. I think, we're all very concerned about how we can protect everyone in our community, everyone who's left vulnerable during this time, and make sure that we all get through this together. My understanding, Mr. Chair, is that the CARES Act that was recently passed by Congress already prohibits any kind of eviction or foreclosure, and that loans that are sold are federally backed loans are included in that. And so I just would like us to take that into consideration. Also, something that I was thinking about was people who may have been evicted prior to the eviction process starting prior to the emergency or the pandemic. And so they would be in the midst of being evicted and being told to get out of their home before the emergency took place. And so, as we heard from many realtors during this time, people have not been able to get into new homes or new properties because government agencies are closed and just having a hard time with that kind of paperwork. So maybe that's something that we can take into consideration in this bill, evictions that were already being processed prior to the pandemic. That's all. Thank you.
And thank you, Senator Amanda Shelton. Senator Kelly Marsh. And if any of my other colleagues would like to ask questions, please send it on the chat so I'll know that you're next. Okay, so I'd like to also recognize that Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes has joined us. Senator Kelly Marsh, you're up for questioning.
So just asking, Mr. Chair. So I commend the author and both of those testifying. It is a complex issue. It hits us at a real basic level, but as each were speaking, we can see that it's a real complex issue and it hits both sides of the equation and perhaps even other sides of the equation really deeply and in a really hard way. It is an important issue. There's a lot of feeling of insecurity during a state of emergency like this. Losing a home to shelters one's family shouldn't be added into the mix. And as was pointed out here, for the landlords, there can also be issues involved. It could be them being able to take care of their families as well. So again, getting back to, it's a complex issue. And so it was important to hear from both sides. I'm glad that it worked out that way. And as was mentioned in the CARES Act, in the executive order, and even through the court's actions, it has provided some security, but it doesn't necessarily assure everything that both the renters and the landlords perhaps need. And maybe we can't get to all of it, but it's best to try for a lot of it. So, you know, by addressing it in legislation, I see that there's benefit that for now and going into the future, it doesn't matter if there's an EO or a statement by the president. It doesn't matter if the courts are open or closed, that there's going to be that security if we think this through and it's able to go forward. So what I'd like to have for consideration also is whether there should be any exception to disallowing eviction, and perhaps getting an opinion from the AG's office or just thinking through amongst the committee. So one of the things that came across my mind was, you know, what if somebody who was a tenant was convicted of a crime and they actually were not in their place, but were at DOC or something, and so there may be exceptions to be thinking about here, just so that we're as comprehensive as possible, and maybe some other reasons. And I'm hoping that partly, as was mentioned before, that there's an ability to think through how we might have some layers about requiring a payment plan or some way to address this issue rather than the rent accumulating until it's this very intimidating amount of rent. And Paratotus Hit has mentioned, you know, not having the late fees, if we could have that in there, perhaps rent freezes, the no retaliation, but then also the not having it reflect badly on their credit. So if there are ways to incorporate that. And yeah, so it's probably too much for the bill to also stretch to consider the landlords and whether they could carry the situation. I'm not sure if it's too much to start considering the landlord's perspective, but maybe that would need to be another bill. Certainly, I think there are those of us, myself included, that have asked the governor to please look at those federal programs and find relief both for the renters and for the landlords. So just Masi, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to express some comments, and that concludes what I have thus far.
All right, thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Luis Munoz, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of questions. Well, I'm not sure if they're questions. Maybe they're just the way I'm reading the bill. It's really not. It's not stopping the. It's not allowing the the person who's renting to not pay. What it's doing is it's just protecting them from being evicted. So there's nothing in the bill that says they don't have to pay just because they don't have a job. Really, the bill is just saying that they cannot be evicted during a state of emergency. So that's the way I'm understanding the bill. And then also, I think some of my concerns are that there are other reasons that could be that a person could be evicted, not so much just for not paying their rent, but also maybe the landlord needs to evict them because they're there's a destruction of the property, or maybe there's some kind of criminal activity going on in there. So I think some of those issues maybe should be in the bill that will allow the landlord to still evict in the event any of these illegal issues are happening, or something within their contract. So that's kind of my concern about the bill too, is it doesn't protect the landlord from other issues rather than not payment. There could be some illegal activity. So those are some of my concerns about the bill as well too, Mr. Chair.
All right, and thank you, Senator Munoz. I'd like to also recognize that Senator Jim Whelan has joined us. I know that Senator Amanda Shelton, you have a follow-up question, and then you'll be followed by the speaker, Tina Munoz Barnes. Senator Amanda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that we're all concerned about finding a balance for both landlords who make their income from homes, that is their business, and we're also very concerned about renters and people having stability in their homes. Like I mentioned earlier, that the CARES Act does provide for protection from evictions, but it also offers protection to landlords within the CARES Act, but something that we may be able to look at. I don't know if it's stretching beyond the scope of this bill, but maybe we can discuss it or offer additional legislation, is that in a future emergency, we also offer forbearance for landlords for their mortgages. And that's something that we can offer as a protection to both parties here.
All righty, thank you, Senator Amanda Shelton. Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes, ma'am, you have a question.
Yes, a question and a comment maybe. And thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do apologize for being late, but I was just reading through the Coronavirus Relief Fund frequently asked question. I did receive a guidance from the U.S. Treasury regarding the CARE Act funds which can be used to help residents who are getting evicted, and share the thought with the legislative secretary. If we can use federal fund resources or funds to help landlords to survive off of the rent, I'd like to say we should do so. And I want to share 2 points on these frequently asked questions that was answered by the Treasury, if I may. The first one would be, may recipients use fund payments to provide emergency financial assistance to individuals and families directly impacted by the loss of income due to the COVID-19 public health emergency? The answer, yes. If a government determines such assistance to be a necessary expenditure, such assistance could include, for example, a program to assist individual payments of overdue rent or mortgage payments to avoid eviction or foreclosure, or unforeseen financial costs for funerals and other emergency individual needs. Such assistance should be structured in a manner to ensure as such as possible within the realm of what is administratively feasible, that such assistance is necessary. And the other question that comes to mind is, would providing a consumer grant program to prevent eviction and assist in preventing homelessness be considered an eligible expense? And the answer to that was yes, assuming that the recipient considers the grants to be necessary expense incurred to COVID-19 public health emergency, and the grants meet the other requirements for the use of fund payments under Section 601D of the Social Security Act outlined in the guidance. As a general matter, providing assistance to recipients to enable them to meet property tax requirements would not be an eligible use of funds, but exemptions may be made in the case of assistance designed to prevent foreclosures. So just reading that, Mr. Chair, and getting the answer from the U.S. Treasury, this FAQ was sent, we just received it, but it was dated May 4th. So I'm hoping that these two questions can put into play some of the facilitation needed to move forward to help our residents who are in need, both from the tenant's perspective and also the landlord's perspective.
Okay, no specific question, just a statement then, right, Madam
Well,
Speaker?
Just based on that, based on my questioning in the beginning is if we want to use help residents from getting evicted, and can we use the federal dollars to help both the landlords who survive off the rent and to help the tenants from getting evicted? My question to you is, I think that it is a doable thing and that we should be able to move forward based on what information we receive from the Treasury.
Understood, Madam Speaker, but maybe a one line or a statement so we can add that on the bill, that maybe the funding source to protect the landlords and the tenants, that it be directed that the governor will find the resources within the CARES funding or any federal funding, and then we put that onus on her and not us, because once we do amendments on the bill, and Senator Therese is probably going to say is that the intent was to protect folks from being evicted. That's one. And then the next one is, now we want to make sure we protect also our landlords, and it has to be both covered. So with that, I think maybe a statement specifically that what would you like to have added onto the bill, and then we can move from there.
Okay, so maybe, Mr. Chair, the main point, based on the answers that I have received, I think that it's important to tell the governor that based on this opportunity and the guidance as received, that we can move forward and assist both the landlord and the tenants. And based on the sections provided, the funds from the CRF can be utilized. That's my personal take. Thank you.
All right, thank you. The next colleague that has a question is Senator Minority Leader Senator Terlaje, ma'am.
Sijus Masi, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity, and just like to say hello, Caitlin. Thank you so much for coming and testifying today. I did speak, not meet, but on the phone with one of your members, Michael. Yes. So
yes,
we had a good conversation on actually providing your group with other opportunities that are out there for you to assist your group, and basically with a lot of information. So as I mentioned earlier, my office takes these calls on people wanting to know what they have out there to assist them during a difficult time. So, but my question to you now is that after this bill that came out, and hearing what everybody has to say, and I didn't actually ask Michael this part, but I would like to see if you can answer it. So what is your suggestion for once this state of emergency has been lifted, and once it's lifted, what are you looking at moving forward after that to assist those with what kind of schedule, in other words, would you recommend, considering, you're in this state? I've spoken to Mike, and all of you guys in this group are having problems. And so, please.
Well, after hearing what you guys were talking about with the landlords, I also believe they need to be protected, and it would be a good idea to add on to the bill that they also that maybe the funds from the CARES Act could also be used to help them, or you know, that banks won't force them to make payments as well. I really believe that both the tenants and landlords should be protected in this. And also, I just wanted to give an example of what LA is doing. I don't know if any of you are aware of what Los Angeles has been doing with the rent freeze. They also, so not only did they put a freeze on rent and mortgages, they also added that the 12 months after the pandemic is over and the lockdown is lifted, that people will be given that much time to pay back the rent and mortgages that are due.
So you recommend that same. Yeah. So what you do, Caitlin, is recommend that same thing apply for Guam, for that a payment plan for those, let's say the lockdown, or it's been lifted after, let's say we're in this for 4 months, for instance, and that's 4 months of rent. So with that 4 months of rent, that within 12 months time, that certain amount divided by that must pay back to the landlord, correct? Regardless if they leave the their place. Let's say somebody moves out after about 3 months afterwards, but they still have this bill, so they're still required and obligated to pay it. So basically, what you're saying is a 12-month period after the lockdown is over, or the restrictions are lifted. We can't just say lockdown because they need to go back to work and stuff. So
yeah,
12 months. Okay, so you're recommending 12.
That's what Los Angeles is doing, and it's also for the landlords. So the landlords and the tenants are not having to pay their mortgages and rent for.
On both sides. Okay,
So this is an example from Los Angeles, and so far, best examples that I've seen.
Okay, well, thank you so much again, Caitlin, and the testimony of those, all those who provided testimony for this particular bill. It's gonna bring a balance, I think, that we need for it, and greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tello. Madam Vice Senator Talina Nelson, ma'am, you have a question. You have questions.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Caitlin, I want to thank you. I have been reading the Paratoto's email, so thank your group also for advocating for many of those that are struggling through this time. I do have a question, Mr. Chair, just to get if we have received any testimony from the Guam Association of Realtors or any other housing development owners, property owners and landlords. Have they submitted any testimony regarding this bill that we are reviewing?
No, ma'am. As a matter of fact, the folks, there was a request for feedback from the Guam Housing Corporation, Guam Housing, or GURA, Guam Chamber of Commerce, Guam Women's Chamber, Guam Realtors Association, Guam Bar Association, the Judiciary of Guam, and none of them have responded yet. But they'll probably respond hopefully soon. They're watching this hearing today.
Okay. All right, Mr. Chair, I am in support of this measure to help those families who are struggling and unable to pay their rent, so they're not evicted. But perhaps we can also look at a way to see what we can do for the landlords who have to pay the mortgages for these rental properties, and maybe we can work something with the banks so it can be a two-pronged bill. If we just work on one solution, we're still hurting the other side of our community as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Caitlin, for the work that you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Vice. I think there's only one of my colleagues here that didn't ask a question, but I'm going to go ahead and post to him if he has any questions. Senator Jim Mullen, do you have anything, even though you're not registered? No, you have no question. Any of my Tello, you have a follow-up? Yes, ma'am. Madam Vice, please.
Okay, I'm up. Okay, I just have a real quick question with regards to Caitlin, how you feel about this. What happens if there are individuals who were not laid off during this pandemic? Essential businesses are still opening. People are actually still working, and they are part of the well, actually, they would have to be separate and apart. They can afford to pay the rent, is what I'm saying. So there would have to be something in there that would also give the
But
opportunity for
you
the
also
landlord.
you'd also have to remember that their jobs are affected by this. My friend is a social worker in LA, and her husband is a nurse, and they're actually the first people that I talked to about this. Is why I mentioned LA. And even them, they're included in this rent mortgage freeze. Everyone is included because even people that are still working, a lot of them, their jobs are still somehow affected, and they are not getting hazard pay. They're being exposed every day to so many people. The grocery store workers, they're not receiving hazard pay. That's also something that we have to think about. That I really believe should be included in the CARES Act. People need to be receiving hazard pay. My other half, he is his hours were reduced, but he is working still once a week on base as a lifeguard. And at the beach, nobody there is wearing a mask, and he's still required to go to work, but has less hours and is exposed to all that. What is the governor going to do about that? What are we going to do about that? And yeah, I just believe that everyone should be included in this. And if you're going to get technical, then you're going to have to get even more technical and see, well, whose job was affected, because some people are working, but they're making less hours, or, they're making less money still somehow. My friend's mom works for DFS, and she was still working in the beginning, but then they cut her hours, and then they forced her to use her own leave. There's so many technical things about it, and the way Los Angeles I dealt with it is they just included everybody in it. Landlords and tenants and everyone, and the government has enough money. The banks can do this. They can do this. They can freeze the rent and mortgages for the landlords and the tenants. They're able to do this.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity for a follow-up, Mr. Chair. And that is something, you're right, Caitlin, I think too, is that it could be technical, and we can get very technical in this legislation for those individuals who did not lose their job and were still having a steady income in, that they would be required to still pay the rent. And how do you do that? So that's something we may have to look into. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I'd like to apologize. I recognize you as the vice. You're the minority leader. Apologize there, Madam Vice, on the side there. Just looking through the list here, I don't see any other questions. I'd like to first, number one, thank the participating participant this afternoon, the representative Paratoru Hit Guam, Ms. Caitlin, and the testimony of Mr. Manibusan. And I'd like to ask, before I ask the author of the bill to close, I'd like to make only one statement that I did ask the legal to check on was to make sure, to ensure that the bill does not waive rights to collect rent lawfully owed to the landlord for the duration of the emergency. I've also asked, wanted to look further into whether the bill brings up any property takings issue for the landlord, and I've asked the legal bureau to research these questions before the bill is reported out of committee. And I like to recognize that if the administration can find suitable homes for homeless, they can sure take some of that money and that's cover then the landlords so that the tenants are not evicted. And that I wanted to make very clear. Senator, the author of the bill, Senator Therese Terlaje, ma'am, for any closing statements on this bill.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and to Ms. McManus and to Mr. Manibusan for their testimony. Very, very helpful. And for my colleagues, of course, their input is also going to be helpful moving forward with this bill. I kept the bill very simple because I feel like rental freezes, the amount of rent that people are going to pay is it's a totally separate bill that I think I did look at California, but they have different issues there in California. And I know we are facing our community might be facing a slight increase in rents because of the increase that GURA has received. They've received an increased ability to, charge or to cover more, pay more to the landlords. And that might just have an effect on the rest of the economy, the landlord economy around Guam. But so we don't talk about rental freeze in this bill right now. It's really just it's a very limited protection from eviction. Again, it's not protection from payment of rent, not in this bill. Although I do agree with all of those that mentioned it, and that's what I was trying to talk about when I said about the executive order directing revenue and taxation to look at that, and that Gita's discussions with us that obviously, yeah, if CARES money is available or any other money is available, if they look at it and provide it towards either the landlord side or the tenant side, that would very much assist. And they made it sound like they were very seriously looking into those programs and that they were just complex. So I am giving them time. I'm hoping they're still going to come up with a program like that actually comes out with the cash. Otherwise, this bill is just intended to strictly take care of the evictions, because during the emergency, they're protected. The executive order protects them, and anyone who has a mortgage with backed by federal institutions, those are all allowed. They're not allowed to evict either. They're not allowed to foreclose, so they're protected. They're just a very few institutions that I think are not covered by that CARES. And so those are really the only ones that might be, moving forward with foreclosures on mortgages, if any. And, but so for the period of the emergency, I think everybody's okay. They're not going to get kicked out. The problem is immediately when the emergency ends, and that's the part that's really, we don't control, and we don't know when that will happen. So this bill was to give them 30 days. I was thinking, if anything we would amend, it would be whether they would need more than 30 days based on whether some other programs become available that they can avail of, and it would give them time to avail of those programs for, to like the unemployment. If it doesn't kick in by the end of the emergency, then I think we need to make it longer. It has to be timing together with the unemployment, the cash that they're going to get to make their rent payments. That's what I'm hoping. So again, I want to thank Mr. Chair, if I could, that there are really, I've heard some stories about landlords who have actually just told their tenants, they know the tenants are not working, and they've allowed them not to pay rent. And so I want to thank those landlords, their generosity, and of course the banks for working with these landlords and everyone who's working with these tenants to try to get them back on their feet. So again, I want to just say this is just a safety net and for that period following the emergency to protect from evictions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Therese. There being no additional individuals to present further testimonies on this bill, the committee will continue to remain open for 10 working days following this hearing. Probably it'll be May 22nd for the acceptance of any additional information or public testimony on the bill. You may submit testimonies to the mailroom of the Guam Legislature in the Guam Congress Building or through email at senatorjoessanalgsin@gmail.com. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending the public hearing. This public joint hearing with my colleague, Senator Therese, and for providing feedback and suggestions. This public hearing is now adjourned. It is now 1:58. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.